If you like these videos, please check out my full course at www.lsat.totaltestprep.net with tons of clearly explained actual LSAT questions written by someone who's mastered test and helped others master it, and an evaluation period where you only pay if you want to continue. All right, so in this video, we're going to cover the basic dimensions of an argument. So, what are the fundamental argument dimensions? Now, what that basically means is how do the premises and conclusions relate to one another? And there's two basic ways in which this is important on the test. So, what are the fundamental relationships between the premises themselves and the premises and the conclusion? So, in terms of meaning, how do they connect the premises and the conclusion? And what determines the strength of the link between the premises and conclusion? So, what is the strength of the conclusion based on what the premises say? All right. So, looking at the argument dimensions, there are two basic types of argument relationships. Now, once again, the argument relationships determine how the premises get to the conclusion. So this deals more with the meaning of what the premises say and the meaning of the conclusion, and how is it that what the premises say, how is it that it leads to the conclusion. Well, information is going to be the information will either be related causally or by constitution. What does that mean? Well, causality is when one state of affairs leads to a transformation in another state of affairs. So looking at this argument here up on the right, it says Jane is studying for the LSAT, therefore Jane is going to do well on the LSAT. So it's a straightforward argument. We see that the first sentence is the premise, the second sentence starts with therefore, that's the conclusion. And what we have here is that Jane's studying leads her to do well on the LSAT. So this is a causal argument because the fact that Jane is studying, that transforms her score or that transforms her performance. You can think of it that way. So it's a question of one factor or one state of affairs, as I say, leading to a transformation. It changes something else. In this case, it changes Jane's performance. Her preparation changes her performance. So this is a causal relationship. Now, a constitution is one state of affairs constitutes or counts as another state of affairs. So this is a constitutive relationship. And so for an example of that, looking over once again on the right, we just changed the argument. It says that Jane is studying for the LSAT. Therefore, Jane is studying for an exam that is required for law school. So you see the difference here. We're no longer saying, we're not making a prediction about what's going to happen in terms of some sort of change or transformation. There's no causal process here. Nothing is changing, nothing is transforming to something else. There's no factors that influence one another in that way. What we have here is the fact that because Jane is studying for the LSAT, and we know that the LSAT is an exam that's required for law school, that means that Jane is studying for an exam that is required for law school because the LSAT counts as an exam, or it is the exam that is required for law school. So this is the second broad type of relationships that you're going to find in the arguments on the test. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go through some examples in terms of the more concrete ways in which you'll see causal and constitutive relationships appear in the arguments. So these relationships are going to appear in different argument types across the logical reasoning and reading comprehension sections. So you can think of it that way, in that you're going to see different kinds of arguments pop up. So for example, characterization types deal with the nature of something. So this is essentially arguments that tell you that something is fits in a particular category, has a specific attribute, that kind of thing. So we're going to have videos that cover these in a lot more detail. This is just the basic overview. And these characterization types are basically constitutive relationships. So something fits the definition to be in a particular category. That's primarily a constitutive relationship. When you're characterizing something, when you're describing its characteristics or attributes, you're talking about what, not so much how it's transforming something else, but what it is like, what its attributes or what its essence is. Evaluation deals with the value of something. So this is another type of relationship, and essentially that's saying the conclusion in these is going to say that something is good or bad in a certain sense. And these also generally involve constitutive relationships. Once again, for a similar reason, in that characterization and evaluation are actually fairly similar. You can think of an evaluation as a type of characterization, in that you're saying that the characteristic of something is that it's good or bad in some way. So for the same reason, it's generally constitutive. Proposal reasoning deals with a call to action. So this is an argument that ends with saying that you should do something, or somebody else, or whoever needs to or should be doing something. It's proposing something. It's telling you that you need to act in a certain way, and these actually tend to involve both causal and constitutive relationships. Likewise, we have the explanation and correlation type, which deals with explaining or establishing a cause for a state or a correlation. So essentially, we're going to be giving some sort of situation, and the conclusion is going to say, here's why that situation is happening. Now, obviously, since we're establishing cause, this generally involves causal relationships. Consequence types deal with the effects of a state. So it's basically going to say, here's what's going on, and then this is what's going to happen in certain variations of that. And actually, the example we used of Jane studying, and therefore Jane's going to do well, is an example of a consequence type, and that once again generally involves causal relationships. The rejection question type deals with a challenge to another's perspective. This is essentially a situation where the author says that the whatever perspective or idea or argument was brought up is wrong or bad for whatever reason. And these also generally involve constitutive relationships. Okay, like I said, we'll go into a lot more detail with respect to these different types. They'll all have their own video, and then we'll explain them as we hit them in the different arguments that we'll have in the lectures and in the exercises. But these are the basic ways in which premises uh, relate to one another and lead to the conclusion. Fundamentally, you're dealing with causal and constitutive relationships, and these are the more specific ways in which that'll manifest. So we'll see all of that in the videos that deal with the specific types of these relationships. Now, in addition to that, as we mentioned earlier, there are also two basic types of, or rather, we didn't mention this, but there are two basic types of argument logical structures, and this is actually where what this is talking about is that logical structures determine the strength of the link between the premises and conclusions. So, what kind of logical structure you have is what is going to uh, be a factor in terms of how well or how strongly your premises lead to your conclusion. So, with respect to the two basic types, the first is inductive reasoning, and this is more everyday and more intuitive. And here the conclusion doesn't follow inevitably from the premises. So you can add new information, and new information can strengthen or weaken the argument. And the emphasis is on whether or not the conclusion is true. So here we see a potential argument. It says that sample argument that Jane is studying for the LSAT, therefore Jane is going to do well in the LSAT. Well, this is an example of an inductive type of argument, because yes, Jane is studying, but maybe Jane is studying only 1 day a week for 2 weeks before the test, or maybe Jane is studying out of poor, not very good materials. Uh, there are different things that you can add to make the conclusion that she's going to do well in the LSAT more or less likely. So this is the first type, and this is one where what's the situation here is that you have certain ideas in the premises, and there is a strength of association, how strongly they're associated, how strongly they're linked with ideas in the conclusion. In this case, studying is a particular concept, and doing well is an associated concept. So we've seen that before, and there's a relatively strong link. But once again, like I said, there's more information you could add or take away. But the point is that there's some sort of association or overlap between what you're talking about in the premises and in the conclusion. And for that, scope is going to be important. Scope just means just how much, how broad the range of ideas is, or how narrow, and does that allow for there to be overlap between what the premises are talking about, what the conclusion is talking about. In this case, the scope is fairly of the premises and the conclusion of studying and of doing well on the test. allows for a relatively uh, strong association between them because our understanding of studying includes, or it's broad enough that it includes the possibility of doing well. And doing well also is something that, in that sense, can be associated with studying. So for these types of inductive reasoning, you're going to be thinking about what exactly is the premise and the conclusion talking about, and does it fit in that sense? And that's what is meant by the scope. Just what exactly is the range of meaning of what you're dealing with. Now, there's also deductive reasoning, which is more mathematical and formal. And here the conclusion follows inevitably from the premises. New info doesn't strengthen or weaken, and the emphasis is more on the logical connections between true statements. So when you encounter this type of reasoning, these types of arguments across the different questions, and they're going to be clustered differently with respect to the different questions. Um, Here, it's more a question of seeing the connections, the logical connections between the actual premises and the conclusion. So here's an example of an argument of that sort. It says that Jane will take the next LSAT. The next LSAT is in June. Therefore, Jane will take the June LSAT. So as you see here, there really isn't anything we can add or take away to make this argument weaker or stronger. This, if it's true that Jane's going to take the next LSAT and the next LSAT is in June, then it automatically and sort of mathematically follows that Jane is going to take the June LSAT. So this is the difference between this one and the previous one, in that here, all we need to see is that there is that connection, that logical connection between the premises, and if it leads inevitably to the conclusion, we know that we're dealing with this type of argument. And in these, conditional reasoning and formal logic play a very important role in these types of arguments. So we'll encounter that a lot, and we'll clarify that quite a bit with respect to conditional reasoning in particular, since it plays a big role in the test. Okay, so in terms of summarizing, at the fundamental level, verbal reasoning is either causal or constitutive, and the arguments that we'll see will generally involve characterization. So, what are the characteristics, attributes of something? Evaluation, how good or bad or something is. Proposal, what should be done. Correlation or explanation, why something is the case. Consequence, what is the consequence of something, what is going to happen. Or rejection, that somebody is wrong in thinking something. So, this is what you want to remember, because this is what you're going to see pop up continuously in the arguments and in the reading comprehension. And in addition, we also know that the structures of the arguments are either going to be deductive, which are more intuitive, more everyday, and it's more about the strong or weak association between what the premises are and conclusion is talking about. Remember, scope is important. Are they talking about the same thing? Can there be overlap? And inductive, which are more mathematical, more formal, logical. And for these, uh, if the statements are true and the logic is good, the conclusion has to follow. That you don't. There's nothing you can add or take away to make the conclusion stronger or weaker. And for these, conditional reasoning is going to be very important. Conditional and formal logic as well, but primarily conditional reasoning is going to pop up all over the test.